Growing up, my brother Nick and I were like two sides of the same coin. He's 5 years younger than me, but if you saw us, you'd think we were twins separated by a glitch in time. Same square jaw, same stormy gray eyes, even the same dimple in our right cheek when we smiled. It was uncanny, and it turned out to be more trouble than I could have ever imagined. Our childhood was a mix of laughter, mischief, and, unfortunately, favoritism. Our parents adored Nick. Don't get me wrong, I wasn't mistreated or anything, but the kid could have asked for a pet tiger, and they'd have gotten one. Meanwhile, I was the dutiful older brother, always looking out for him, cleaning up his messes. It was exhausting, but I loved him. Blood's thicker than water, right? Nick, though, wasn't just a pampered kid. Over time, that golden boy treatment turned him sly. He'd flash that winning grin, and suddenly, he'd be borrowing money, taking credit for my ideas, or introducing himself as me to get out of trouble. And I let him because, well, it was Nick. What's the worst that could happen? Enter Sarah. She was a vision when I met her, tall, with chestnut hair that seemed to catch every ray of sunlight. We met at a local cafe where she worked part-time, and before long, she had me wrapped around her finger. After a whirlwind romance, we tied the knot. Life was good, at least for the first 5 years. Looking back, I can't pinpoint exactly when Sarah started to change. Maybe it was subtle at first, like the way the tide pulls back before a tsunami. She'd been everything I ever wanted in a partner, beautiful, smart, and full of life. But then, piece by piece, that spark started to dim. At first, it was the little things. She started going to bed earlier, claiming she was too tired to stay up and talk like we used to. Her phone, once left carelessly on the kitchen counter, was now glued to her hand. She'd always been affectionate, but now her kisses felt hollow, like she was going through the motions. I chalked it up to stress. She'd been picking up extra hours at work, and I figured maybe she just needed space. After all, I wasn't home much either. My job as a police officer demanded long hours, especially the night shifts. But as the months dragged on, the distance between us grew wider, and it wasn't just physical. It felt like I was living with a stranger. One night, after a grueling shift, I came home to find her already asleep. I leaned down to kiss her on the forehead, but she flinched. Just slightly, but enough to make my heart sink. "Rough day?" I asked. She mumbled something incoherent and rolled over, her back to me. I lay awake for hours that night, staring at the ceiling and wondering what was slipping through my fingers. The changes didn't stop there. She became secretive, almost territorial about her time. A simple, "How was your day?" would earn me a clipped response or an irritated sigh. She started making plans without me, dinners with friends, weekend trips that I wasn't invited to, or last-minute errands that always seemed to take hours. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe I was overthinking it. Maybe I was paranoid because of the kinds of things I'd seen on the job. But then came the moments I couldn't ignore. One Friday evening, I got home early, an unexpected reprieve from a cancelled shift. I was hoping to surprise Sarah with a quiet night in, but when I walked through the door, the house was eerily quiet. Her shoes were gone, and so was her car. I called her, but it went straight to voicemail. When she finally came home hours later, she looked startled to see me. "Oh," she said, fumbling with her purse. "I thought you were working late." "I got off early," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "Where were you?" "Out with some coworkers," she replied, avoiding eye contact. "Which coworkers?" She hesitated, just for a second, but it was long enough to make my stomach churn. "Just some girls from work." "You wouldn't know them." I wanted to believe her. I really did. But something about the way she avoided my gaze, the way her hands trembled ever so slightly as she put her purse down, made me feel like I was staring at a stranger. That night, I couldn't shake the unease. I sat in the living room long after she'd gone to bed, replaying every odd interaction, every distant glance, every excuse she'd made in the past few months. Was I losing her? Or had I already lost her without realizing it? The following weeks only added fuel to the fire. She started dressing differently, more effort, more perfume, more time spent in front of the mirror before she left the house. When I asked her about it, she brushed it off, saying she just wanted to feel good about herself. But she didn't seem to care how she looked when she was with me. By this point, my mind was racing with possibilities, none of them good. I'd seen enough betrayals in my line of work to know the signs, but I couldn't bring myself to confront her. What if I was wrong? What if I accused her of something she wasn't doing and drove an even bigger wedge between us? I decided to keep my suspicions to myself, for now. But the cracks in our marriage were becoming impossible to ignore, and I was terrified of what might come next. The silence between us became deafening. Sarah and I used to talk about everything, work, dreams, even the mundane details of our days. But now, every attempt at conversation felt like shouting into an empty canyon. I'd ask her about her day, and she'd give me one-word answers. Fine. Busy. Tiring. Sometimes, she didn't bother answering at all, just nodding absent-mindedly as if I were an annoying commercial interrupting her thoughts. The more she pulled away, the harder I tried to reach her. I started doing little things to rekindle what we'd lost. I'd bring her flowers after work, just because. Support the channel by subscribing, it really makes a difference. I'd surprise her with her favorite takeout on nights she said she didn't feel like cooking. Once, I even tried to recreate the dinner from our first anniversary. I lit candles, cooked the same meal, and even put on the shirt she used to call her favorite. When she walked through the door that night, I could see the surprise on her face. But it quickly turned into something else, annoyance? Guilt? I wasn't sure. What's all this? She asked, dropping her bag on the floor. Just wanted to do something nice for you, I said, forcing a smile. She stood there for a moment, then sighed. That's sweet, Eric, but I had a long day. I'm not really hungry. My heart sank. I'd spent hours planning the evening, hoping it might remind her of who we used to be. But she didn't even sit down. She walked past the table, muttered something about taking a shower, and disappeared upstairs. That night, I sat alone at the candlelit table, staring at the empty seat across from me. The food went cold, the wine untouched. I felt like a fool. Work became my escape. As a police officer, my days were unpredictable, a mix of routine patrols, tense calls, and the occasional moments of camaraderie with my colleagues. But even on my busiest shifts, Sarah was always at the back of my mind. I'd replay our conversations, or lack thereof, wondering where I went wrong. One night, during a particularly quiet shift, my partner, Joe, noticed I wasn't myself. "You good, Rick?" he asked, his voice breaking through my thoughts. "Yeah," I lied. Joe smirked. "You're a terrible liar. Come on, spill." I hesitated, but the truth poured out before I could stop it. "It's Sarah," I admitted. "She's different lately. Distant. Cold." Joe nodded knowingly. "Marriage can be tough. Have you talked to her about it?" I laughed bitterly. Talking to her feels like talking to a wall. She's either too busy or too tired or just not interested. Joe didn't say anything for a while. He just stared out the window, the red and blue lights of our patrol car casting shadows on his face. Finally, he spoke. "Sometimes, people grow apart, Rick. Doesn't mean it's the end. But you've got to figure out what's really going on. Otherwise, it'll eat you alive." His words stayed with me long after the shift ended. Was that what was happening? Were we just growing apart? Or was it something more? At home, things didn't improve. Sarah's behavior became more erratic. Some days, she was completely disengaged, scrolling through her phone or lost in her own world. Other days, she'd act almost normal, laughing at a joke or asking how my day was. But those moments were fleeting, like flashes of lightning in a stormy sky. She started spending more time away from home. Work events, she'd say. Or meeting friends. I wanted to believe her, I really did. But the late nights and vague explanations started to weigh on me. One evening, I came home early and found her in the living room, dressed to the nines. Her hair was curled, her makeup flawless, and she was wearing a dress I hadn't seen in years. "Wow," I said, trying to keep the surprise out of my voice. "You look amazing. What's the occasion?" She glanced at me, her expression unreadable. "Just meeting some coworkers for drinks." "At this hour?" She shrugged. "It's a late-night thing. Don't wait up." And just like that, she was gone, leaving me standing in the doorway with a growing knot in my stomach. I tried to shake the feeling off. Maybe I was being paranoid. Maybe Joe was right, it was just a rough patch. But as the weeks turned into months, I couldn't ignore the gnawing sense that something was wrong. Every time I tried to bridge the gap between us, she pushed me further away. The woman I'd married, the woman I'd loved with every fiber of my being, was slipping through my fingers, and I had no idea how to stop it. At some point, something inside me shifted. Maybe it was exhaustion from trying so hard and getting nowhere, or maybe it was the realization that I couldn't fix a relationship if I was the only one fighting for it. Whatever the reason, I started pulling back. It wasn't a calculated decision. I didn't wake up one morning and decide to ice Sarah out. It just happened, bit by bit. I stopped asking her how her day was. I stopped bringing her flowers or trying to plan date nights. When she dressed up for another work event, I barely glanced at her. Support the channel by subscribing, it really makes a difference. At first, she didn't seem to notice. If anything, she seemed relieved, as if my withdrawal made things easier for her. But as the days turned into weeks, something strange started happening. One morning, as I was getting ready for work, Sarah came into the kitchen, her hair tousled and her face bare of makeup. She stood in the doorway, watching me pour coffee into my travel mug. "Do you want breakfast?" she asked. I glanced at her, surprised. It had been months since she'd offered to make me anything. "I'm good," I said, keeping my tone neutral. Her brow furrowed. "Are you sure? I could make eggs or pancakes or—" I said I'm good, I interrupted, closing the lid on my mug. She didn't say anything as I grabbed my keys and left, but the look on her face stayed with me all day. Over the next few days, she kept trying. She'd sit beside me on the couch, leaning closer than she had in months. She'd laugh at my jokes, even the bad ones, and touch my arm as if trying to remind me of the intimacy we once shared. One night, she curled up beside me in bed, her head resting on my shoulder. "Do you remember our first date?" she asked, her voice soft. "Not really," I lied, staring at the ceiling. She sat up, her eyes searching my face. "You don't remember the cafe? How nervous you were. You spilled coffee all over the table, and I couldn't stop laughing." I shrugged. It was a long time ago. Her expression faltered, but she didn't give up. "I've been thinking, maybe we should take a trip. Just the two of us. Get away from everything for a while." "Can't," I said flatly. "Work's too busy." Sarah's frustration finally boiled over. She threw the covers off and got out of bed, pacing the room. "What is wrong with you, Eric? Why are you acting like this?" "Acting like what?" "Like you don't care," she snapped. "I'm trying here. I'm trying to fix this, but you won't meet me halfway." I sat up, the anger I'd been suppressing bubbling to the surface. "Fix this? You're the one who created this mess, Sarah. You've been distant and secretive for months, and now you expect me to just forget all that because you've suddenly decided to play the doting wife again? She flinched, but her eyes blazed with determination. I've made mistakes. I know that. But I'm trying to make things right. Why won't you let me? I stared at her, my emotions a tangled mess of anger, hurt, and a flicker of something else, hope. I don't know if you can make this right, Sarah. I don't even know if I want you to. Her face crumpled, and for the first time in months, she looked genuinely vulnerable. She sat down on the edge of the bed, her head in her hands. I'm scared, Eric. I'm scared I've lost you. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. Part of me wanted to comfort her, to pull her into my arms and tell her everything would be okay. But another part of me, the part that had been carrying the weight of her coldness and secrecy, held back. I don't know what to tell you, I said quietly. She looked up at me, tears streaming down her face. Please, Eric. Don't give up on us. I didn't answer. Instead, I turned off the light and lay down, staring into the darkness. Her sobs eventually quieted, and I could feel her trembling beside me. But I didn't move. For the first time, it felt like the power dynamic in our relationship had shifted. I didn't know if it was a good thing or a bad thing, but one thing was certain: the cracks in our marriage weren't going to heal overnight. The morning after Sarah's tearful plea, I expected the same frostiness that had defined our interactions for months. Instead, she surprised me. I came downstairs to find her in the kitchen, flipping pancakes. The smell of butter and syrup filled the air, and for a moment, it felt like a snapshot from our earlier years. She wore one of my old shirts, her hair loosely tied back, and when she saw me, her face lit up with a tentative smile. Breakfast, she said, holding up a plate stacked with golden pancakes. I hesitated, unsure of how to respond. You didn't have to do that. I wanted to, she said quickly. I thought we could eat together. Like we used to. Something about the way she said it, the softness in her voice, the way her eyes darted away like she was afraid of rejection, made it hard to say no. I sat down at the table, and she placed the plate in front of me, along with a cup of coffee. Support the channel by subscribing, it really makes a difference. We ate in near silence, the clinking of forks against plates the only sound. But every so often, I'd catch her watching me, her expression a mix of hope and sadness. It wasn't the last time she made an effort. Over the next few days, she went out of her way to be present, to ask about my day, to cook dinner, to sit beside me on the couch even when I said nothing. At first, I chalked it up to guilt, but the consistency of her attempts made me question that. One night, as we sat together watching TV, she leaned her head on my shoulder. Do you remember when we used to stay up all night talking about nothing and everything? Yeah, I said cautiously. I miss that, she said softly. I miss us. I didn't know how to respond, so I stayed quiet. She didn't push. But as much as I wanted to believe in this version of Sarah, something didn't sit right. Her sudden shift felt almost too convenient, too rehearsed. It was as if she sensed that I was slipping away and was trying to reel me back in. I started testing her without even realizing it. When she asked me to take a weekend off to go on a mini getaway, I said I couldn't. When she suggested we have dinner at our favorite restaurant, I shrugged and told her to make the reservation if she wanted. Part of me wanted to see if she'd keep trying, or if she'd give up and retreat into her old coldness. But she didn't retreat. If anything, she doubled down. One Friday evening, I came home to find her in the dining room, candles lit and soft music playing. She'd cooked an elaborate dinner, steak, roasted vegetables, even dessert. What's all this? I asked, taken aback. Just, something special, she said, fidgeting with the edge of her napkin. I thought we could have a nice evening together. I sat down, unsure of what to say. The effort she'd put into the evening was undeniable, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was too little, too late. As we ate, she tried to fill the silence with light conversation, stories from work, memories from our early years together. She laughed at her own jokes, glancing at me nervously to see if I'd laugh too. After dinner, she poured us both glasses of wine and leaned across the table. "Eric," she began, her voice trembling. "I know things haven't been good between us lately. And I know it's mostly my fault. But I want to fix it. I want to fix us." I stared at her, the words catching in my throat. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that we could go back to the way things were. But the doubt that had taken root in my mind over the past year refused to let go. "I don't know, Sarah," I said finally. "I don't know if it's that simple." "It doesn't have to be simple," she said quickly, her eyes shining with tears. "I just need you to give me a chance. Please." Her desperation was palpable, and for a moment, I felt a pang of guilt. But I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that there was more to her sudden change than met the eye. "Okay," I said reluctantly. "Let's see where it goes." Her face lit up, and she reached across the table to squeeze my hand. But as much as I wanted to feel hopeful, a part of me couldn't shake the suspicion that her newfound affection was a facade, a way to distract me from whatever she didn't want me to see. In the weeks that followed, Sarah's efforts to repair our relationship became relentless. She planned date nights, cooked elaborate meals, and even suggested we take dance lessons, something we joked about doing when we first got married but never actually tried. I played along, unsure if it was out of curiosity or guilt. Maybe a part of me still wanted to believe in the version of us she was trying to recreate. But another part of me couldn't let go of the nagging doubt, the voice in my head whispering that this wasn't as simple as it seemed. Her warmth was disarming, even intoxicating at times. When she'd rest her head on my shoulder during a movie or laugh at my jokes the way she used to, I'd catch myself thinking that maybe, just maybe, we could make it work. But then, late at night, when I'd catch her staring off into the distance with a look I couldn't quite place, the doubt would come rushing back. One evening, after a particularly nice dinner, Sarah leaned over the table and smiled at me. "I was thinking," she began, her tone light but her eyes serious. "Maybe we should take a weekend trip. Just us. Somewhere quiet." It was the third time she'd brought it up, and I still wasn't sure what to make of it. "I don't know, Sarah," I said, swirling the wine in my glass. "Work's been crazy. It's hard to get away." She reached across the table and placed her hand over mine. "You work too hard, Eric. You need a break. We both do." I looked at her, trying to read her expression. She seemed earnest, but there was a tension in her voice, a slight edge that made me pause. "I'll think about it," I said finally. Her smile faltered, but she recovered quickly. "Okay," she said, withdrawing her hand. "But don't think too long. I'll book something before you know it." Her persistence unsettled me. It wasn't just about the trip, it was about everything. Her sudden devotion, her constant need to please me, her insistence on spending time together. It felt like she was trying to convince me of something, but I couldn't figure out what. Meanwhile, my own behavior had shifted in ways I didn't fully understand. I found myself testing her without meaning to, coming home late without notice, leaving my phone on the table to see if she'd glance at it, asking vague questions about her day to gauge her reactions. Support the channel by subscribing, it really makes a difference. One night, after a late shift, I came home to find her waiting for me in the living room. She was curled up on the couch in one of my old sweatshirts, a book resting in her lap. "You're up late," I said, shrugging off my jacket. "I couldn't sleep," she said, setting the book aside. "I was waiting for you." I paused, caught off guard. "Why?" She looked at me, her eyes soft and searching. "Because I miss you, Eric. I miss us." Her words were a knife to the gut. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to grab her and tell her I missed her too, that everything would be okay. But something held me back. Instead, I sat down across from her, the weight of the day pressing down on me. "You've been saying that a lot lately," I said carefully. "Because it's true," she said, her voice trembling. "I know I've been distant. I know I've made mistakes. But I'm trying, Eric. Doesn't that count for something?" "It does," I admitted. "But I can't shake the feeling that there's something you're not telling me." Her face froze for a moment, her eyes darting to the floor. "What do you mean?" "I mean, all of this," I gestured around the room, at the candles on the coffee table and the wine glasses on the counter. "It feels like you're trying to distract me." "From what? I don't know." Her jaw tightened, and for a moment, I thought she might snap. But then she took a deep breath and met my gaze. "I'm not hiding anything, Eric. I just want us to be happy again." Her words sounded sincere, but the hesitation in her voice betrayed her. Something was still off, and no amount of romantic dinners or heartfelt conversations could cover it up. As she got up and went to bed, I sat alone in the living room, staring at the flickering candles and wondering how long I could keep pretending that everything was fine. The routine of Sarah's renewed affection should have been comforting, but it wasn't. Each gesture of hers, another candle at dinner, another suggestion for a weekend getaway, felt more like a performance than genuine love. I couldn't tell if she was acting out of guilt or fear, but one thing was clear: something had changed, and I wasn't sure if I liked it. I buried myself in work. It wasn't hard to do, the job came with endless distractions. Night shifts, unpredictable calls, and the adrenaline of the streets left little room for dwelling on my failing marriage. At least, that's what I told myself. But even on my busiest nights, thoughts of Sarah would creep in, uninvited. She'd been persistent about the trip. Every few days, she'd drop hints, leaving travel brochures on the counter or casually mentioning deals she'd found. It felt like she was trying to escape something, not just the monotony of our life, but maybe her own secrets. Meanwhile, her mood had grown more unpredictable. One evening, after I'd brushed off another of her suggestions, she slammed a drawer so hard it nearly broke. "I'm trying, Eric," she snapped, her face flushed. Her anger didn't faze me. It was the desperation in her voice that caught my attention. She wasn't just mad, she was scared. But scared of what? I started paying closer attention, not to her words, but to the small details, the way her phone never left her side, the nervous glances she cast when she thought I wasn't looking, the tension in her shoulders when she thought I was about to say something important. At work, my partner Joe noticed I was distracted. "You're not yourself, Rick," he said one night during a quiet patrol. "Something eating at you?" I shrugged, not ready to share. But his words stayed with me. He was right, I wasn't myself. Back at home, Sarah's efforts to repair our relationship grew more intense. She started cooking meals she hadn't made in years, asking me to join her for walks in the evenings, even suggesting we revisit places we used to love. But no matter how hard she tried, the gulf between us remained. Her actions felt hollow, like she was trying to patch a dam that had already burst. One night, after she'd gone to bed, I sat in the living room, staring at her phone on the counter. It buzzed with a notification, a harmless reminder about an appointment. But seeing it there, so close yet so guarded, made my stomach churn. I told myself I wouldn't snoop. That wasn't who I was. But the doubt gnawed at me, growing louder with every unanswered question. As I sat there in the dark, the pieces of our life together began to rearrange themselves in my mind, forming a picture I didn't want to see. The unease between Sarah and me lingered, like a low hum in the background of every moment. It wasn't just her sudden shift into overdrive with the affection, though that alone was unsettling, it was everything. The way she seemed to be watching me as much as I was watching her, like we were both waiting for the other to crack. Her warmth toward me had started to feel performative, yet relentless. Mornings came with fresh brewed coffee and breakfast, dinners were lavish affairs with wine and candlelight, and weekends became packed with plans to rekindle what we'd lost. She was trying so hard it felt suffocating. And yet, I couldn't entirely resist the pull. Her laughter, the way her hand would brush mine as we walked through the park, the moments of quiet vulnerability when she let her guard down, they reminded me of the Sarah I had fallen in love with. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was all a prelude to something she wasn't ready to admit. I started pulling back more intentionally, testing her in subtle ways. I'd leave the house without telling her where I was going or come home later than usual, watching her reaction each time. Some days, she'd press me with questions, her voice tinged with frustration. Support the channel by subscribing, it really makes a difference. Other days, she'd stay quiet, her eyes darting to her phone or out the window, lost in thought. She stopped bringing up the weekend trip, though. I noticed that almost immediately. It was as if she realized I wasn't going to budge and shifted her strategy. One evening, I came home to find her standing in the living room, staring at a photo of us from our wedding day. She was holding it in both hands, her fingers tracing the edges of the frame. "We look happy," she said when she noticed me. "We were," I replied, my tone even. She set the photo down carefully and turned to me, her eyes glassy. "Do you ever think about how things used to be?" "Sometimes." Her face crumpled slightly, but she quickly composed herself. "I want us to get back to that, Eric. I want us to be those people again." I didn't respond. Instead, I walked into the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water. I could feel her eyes on me, but I didn't look back. The next morning, I woke up to find her already dressed and sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee. She looked like she hadn't slept. "I've been thinking," she said as I poured my own coffee. "About what?" "About us." I sat down across from her, waiting for her to continue. "I know I've been difficult," she said carefully. "And I know I haven't given you much reason to trust me lately." Understatement of the year, I thought but didn't say. "But I want to fix this, Eric. I'm willing to do whatever it takes." "Why now?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. Her eyes widened slightly, and for a moment, I thought she might snap. But then she took a deep breath and said, "Because I'm scared. Scared of losing you." The vulnerability in her voice caught me off guard. For a split second, I saw a glimpse of the Sarah I'd married, the Sarah who had once been so open and full of life. But then the moment passed, and I was left with the same gnawing doubt. "I don't know what you want me to say," I said finally. "I don't want you to say anything," she replied. "I just want you to give me a chance." I nodded, more to end the conversation than out of agreement. As the days went on, her efforts intensified. She started joining me on my evening runs, despite having avoided exercise for most of our marriage. She bought tickets to a concert by a band we used to love, even though she hadn't mentioned them in years. But it wasn't just her actions that changed, it was her demeanor. She became more attentive, more affectionate. She'd rest her hand on my arm during dinner, laugh at my jokes with genuine delight, and kiss me goodnight like she hadn't in months. It was almost enough to convince me that things were turning around. Almost. But late at night, when the house was quiet and Sarah was asleep beside me, I couldn't stop my mind from racing. The signs were still there, the guardedness, the way her phone was always within reach, the flicker of tension that crossed her face whenever I brought up anything from the past few months. I started noticing patterns. Her phone would buzz at odd hours, and she'd quickly silence it. She'd excuse herself to make calls in the other room, her voice hushed and strained. One day, while cleaning the bedroom, I found a receipt in her purse for a hotel I didn't recognize. It was dated months earlier, around the time she'd told me she was at a work retreat. The knot in my stomach tightened. I wanted to confront her then and there, to demand answers. But something held me back. Maybe it was fear of what I might uncover, fear of what it would mean for us. Or maybe it was denial, the desperate hope that I was wrong. Instead, I slipped the receipt back into her purse and resolved to wait. If there was something to uncover, I needed more than a single scrap of paper. The tension in the house grew palpable. Sarah continued her campaign of affection, but I could see the cracks in her facade. She was trying so hard, but her eyes betrayed her, eyes that were tired, anxious, and, at times, haunted. I told myself it was only a matter of time before the truth came out. But as the days dragged on, I wondered if I'd be ready for it when it finally did. It was a quiet Thursday night when everything unraveled. I was working the night shift, as I often did, patrolling the familiar streets and sipping coffee that had long gone cold. The evening had been uneventful, a string of minor calls and routine checks. Around 10 p.m., I realized I'd left my badge and some personal documents at home. Annoyed at my own carelessness, I decided to swing by the house to grab them. The house was dark when I pulled into the driveway, save for a faint glow coming from the living room window. My first thought was that Sarah had fallen asleep on the couch, as she sometimes did when I worked late. But as I stepped inside, the scene before me shattered any semblance of normalcy. Sarah's shoes were by the door, neatly placed, as always. But next to them was a pair of men's sneakers I didn't recognize. My stomach clenched, and a strange sense of detachment washed over me as I moved further into the house. The first thing I noticed was the trail of clothing, Sarah's dress draped over the back of the couch, a man's jacket tossed carelessly onto the armrest. And then I heard it. Muted laughter, followed by a soft, unmistakable moan. It was coming from our bedroom. My chest tightened, and for a moment, I couldn't move. The sound was like a dagger twisting in my gut, each muffled noise driving it deeper. My hands trembled as I reached for the bedroom door, pushing it open with more force than I intended. The scene inside was surreal, like something out of a nightmare. Support the channel by subscribing, it really makes a difference. Sarah was there, tangled in the sheets with a man I knew all too well. My brother, Nick. The shock hit me first, a cold, paralyzing wave that rooted me to the spot. Nick's face turned pale when he saw me, his usual smirk replaced by wide-eyed panic. Sarah gasped, clutching the sheets to her chest as if modesty mattered now. "Eric," she stammered, her voice a mix of fear and desperation. I can explain." But I didn't want to hear it. Without a word, I crossed the room and punched Nick square in the jaw. He yelped, falling off the bed in a heap. I didn't stop there. A second punch landed on his temple, and a third caught his nose, leaving him groaning on the floor. "Eric, stop!" Sarah screamed, grabbing my arm. I shook her off, my voice low and cold. "Get out." She froze, her eyes brimming with tears. "Please, just listen." I said get out. I roared, the sound of my voice echoing through the room. Nick scrambled to his feet, clutching his face. "Eric, man, I'm sorry. I didn't mean." "You didn't mean to what?" I snarled, advancing on him. "To betray your own brother? To destroy my marriage?" He stumbled back, his hands raised in a pathetic attempt at self-defense. "It just happened. I swear." "Get out of my house," I said, my voice dangerously calm. Nick hesitated for a moment before grabbing his clothes and bolting for the door. Sarah stood there, trembling, the sheets still clutched around her. "I didn't want this to happen," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Spare me the excuses," I said, my tone icy. "You made your choices. Now live with them." Her tears spilled over, but I felt nothing. The woman I had loved, the woman I had built a life with, was gone. All that remained was a stranger I wanted nothing to do with. "Eric, please," she begged. "We can fix this. I'll do whatever it takes." "You already did enough," I said, turning away from her. "Pack your things and leave." I don't want to see you here when I get back. She didn't move, her sobs filling the silence as I walked out of the room. I grabbed my documents from the kitchen counter, my mind racing as I left the house. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel anger or sadness. I felt hollow. Weeks after that night, Sarah began her campaign to win me back. At first, it was texts, long, rambling messages about how sorry she was, how she still loved me, how she couldn't imagine her life without me. Then came the phone calls, pleading for just 5 minutes to explain. I ignored her at first, letting the texts go unread and sending her calls to voicemail. But one evening, I came home to find her sitting on my porch, bundled in a coat and clutching a steaming thermos. She looked like she hadn't slept in days. "Eric," she said as I approached. Her voice cracked, and tears welled in her eyes. "Please. Just hear me out." I wanted to tell her to leave, to tell her that nothing she could say would change what had happened. But something about the desperation in her voice made me pause. With a reluctant nod, I gestured for her to speak. "I'm not asking you to forgive me," she began, her hands trembling as she clutched the thermos. "I just need you to know the truth. All of it." Her words tumbled out in a rush, and as she spoke, the pieces of her betrayal started to form an even darker picture than I'd imagined. "It started 2 years ago," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "At Nick's birthday party. I was drinking, a lot. More than I should have." I nodded stiffly, saying nothing. "And then Nick came up to me," she continued. He pretended to be you, Eric. He used your cologne, wore a shirt I'd seen you in before, and said things only you would know. I didn't realize it wasn't you until it was too late." I felt my jaw tighten, anger bubbling just beneath the surface. "You didn't realize?" I asked, my voice cold. Support the channel by subscribing, it really makes a difference. "I swear, I thought it was you," she said, tears streaming down her face. "But then, after that night, he came to me again. He said it was a mistake, but I let it happen. And I kept letting it happen." Her words hit me like a sledgehammer. I had imagined many scenarios of how this affair began, but this was beyond anything I could have prepared for. "Why?" I asked, my voice low and steady. She flinched at the question, her eyes darting to the ground. "I don't know," she admitted. "At first, I felt trapped. But then I liked it. I liked the attention. I liked the way he made me feel, like I was someone else, living another life. And after a while, it became normal. A routine." Her confession left me reeling. It wasn't just a mistake, a lapse in judgment, it was a calculated betrayal that spanned years. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked, my voice hard. "Because I've lost everything," she said, her voice breaking. "You. My home. My dignity. And I deserve it. But I can't live with myself if I don't at least try to tell you the truth." For a moment, I said nothing. I wanted to scream at her, to tell her how deeply she'd hurt me, to make her feel a fraction of the pain I'd endured. But as I looked at her, broken, desperate, and clinging to the shreds of a life she'd destroyed, I realized that nothing I could say would change what had happened. "I'm glad you told me the truth," I said finally. "But it doesn't change anything, Sarah. We're done." Her shoulders slumped, and she nodded, her tears falling silently onto the porch. Without another word, she got up and walked away, disappearing into the night. For the first time in months, I felt a strange sense of clarity. The wounds she'd left were still raw, but at least now I knew the full truth. 3 years had passed since the night my life fell apart. In that time, I'd rebuilt myself from the ground up. The scars from Sarah's betrayal remained, but they had faded into something I could live with, a reminder of how far I'd come. My new girlfriend, Emma, was everything Sarah wasn't. She was kind, genuine, and, most importantly, honest. She brought a lightness to my life that I hadn't realized I'd been missing. We'd been together for over a year now, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I was happy. One sunny afternoon, I was driving back from picking up takeout for Emma and me. The radio played softly in the background as I cruised through the familiar streets of our city. I wasn't paying much attention when I turned onto a narrow alley to take a shortcut home. That's when I saw them. Near a dumpster at the end of the alley, two figures crouched, rummaging through trash bags. At first, I didn't think much of it. But as I got closer, the sight stopped me cold. It was Nick and Sarah. I slowed down, the absurdity of the moment washing over me. They looked nothing like the people I'd once known. Nick's once boyish charm had been replaced with a gaunt, haggard look. His clothes were filthy, his hair unkempt, and his eyes darted around like a man constantly on edge. Sarah looked just as bad. Her radiant beauty, the feature she had so proudly flaunted, was gone. Her face was pale and drawn, her hair tangled, and she wore mismatched, dirty clothes that hung off her thin frame. They were arguing, probably over whatever scraps they'd managed to find. Nick gestured angrily at Sarah, and she fired back with a venomous glare. It was clear that whatever bond they'd once shared had been worn down to nothing. I parked a short distance away and watched for a moment, unable to look away. A strange mixture of emotions churned inside me. There was no pity, no sadness, only a grim satisfaction. The mighty had fallen. Nick, who had always coasted through life on charm and manipulation, was now reduced to scrounging in dumpsters. Sarah, who had traded loyalty and love for fleeting thrills, was now living with the consequences of her choices. I rolled down the window and called out, unable to resist. "Hey, Nick!" "Hey, Sarah!" They froze, turning to look at me. Recognition dawned on their faces, followed quickly by shame. Nick's eyes widened, and he tried to look defiant, but it was clear he had nothing left to stand on. Sarah looked away, her face flushing with humiliation. "What happened?" I asked, feigning concern. "You two look like you've seen better days." Nick mumbled something, but I couldn't hear it, and I didn't care. "It turns out," I continued, my voice light, "you can't build a life on lies and betrayal." "Who would have thought?" I chuckled, shaking my head. "Good luck with whatever this is." With that, I rolled up the window and drove away, leaving them behind in the alley. As I pulled back onto the main road, a strange sense of closure settled over me. I hadn't expected to feel anything when I saw them again, but now, I realized it was over. They were no longer a part of my life, just shadows of a past I'd left behind. Emma greeted me with a smile when I got home, and I wrapped my arms around her, grateful for the life I'd built. Nick and Sarah had made their choices, and they were paying the price. I, on the other hand, was finally free. Support the channel by subscribing, it really makes a difference.